Why don't we all just take a deep breath? I have a few things I want to say, but mostly I just want to say thank you. I thought I would just highlight a few things, but mostly this is for you. If nothing else, you all can watch how someone does this, because you could be doing this in the future. I think virtual training like this, live virtual workshops, could be the way of the future. So, about 10 of, I'll let you go, if not before, as you have people coming in, or if you can find somebody that's already there that might do greeting. As I mentioned in the site coordinator notes I sent, this is an interactive workshop that I will lead. And as you saw from the PowerPoint, there are probably 10 to 12 activities where I'm going to ask people to turn to somebody, get in a new partner. If you want to put people into concentric circles so it's easier to move, I do have at least one triad, but you can figure that out. You can put them into fours and give the fourth person something else to do. I have, as you saw in the PowerPoint, maybe 4 to 5 places where at this point I'm asking you to debrief. And all I mean by that is asking those 2 questions. And they were something like, what was the impact of doing this? Insights, reflections. I intend those to be short because this is you'll hear me say this, it's a smorgasbord. At least 4 to 6 of these activities you could do in follow-up, pull people back together, and literally they would be 20 to 40 minutes each activity, if not longer. And so when I was strategically thinking about this, I just want to do 5-10 minutes on each one, some are 15, so that people can be reflecting, small group, and then some debrief, knowing that even in 40 minutes we wouldn't be done. Given that, there might be people that, especially if they're newer to this work, as you saw, we'll start with socialization. I intended to put a few more things in to warm the group up and connect the group. And as we get to looking at internalized dominance, the common racist behaviors of whites, that's where many folks trigger themselves. And so you may want to be watching the folk, and if someone feels really out, like, ooh, they're really deep trigger, you may, especially you, or if you have 1 or 2 folks that could just say, do you want to chat for a moment? I don't think that's going to happen. I think people will take care of themselves. And you just may want to have that in the back of your mind, that somebody might hit something. People will leave each activity unfinished. And even if I'm doing an all-day session here in Denver on March 23rd, where we'll do many of these activities and a couple more with more time, and people will still leave unfinished. So as you do follow-up, that's just, I think, part of white affinity work. I will say this, but many of you may have folks who identify as biracial, multiracial, indigenous or native, people of color, monoracial in the session. And actually, you might be too as a site coordinator. And so when I've done this workshop in national and regional conferences, I've always had mixed groups. I say this is about whiteness and we're dismantling racism from developing white allies. And there are a couple activities that folks of color, people multiracial, biracial, native may decide they're like, I want to talk to someone of at least a marginalized racial identity for this. But in some of my workshops, even all day stuff, folks of color, some of them have wanted to be in interracial with whites. So that's probably going to happen, but I will offer that. I know one campus is actually having 2 different rooms or 2 different areas of the room, and a facilitator of color that will be with folks of color and multiracial, biracial that want to be with other marginalized folks. And some of the white folks may trigger themselves because they're like, ooh, there's a person of color, I'm talking about racist dynamics that I've done. Yeah. So that's the container we're creating. If you don't have some extra 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper or note paper or an easel chart, I apologize. I just had this thought and I didn't tell you yesterday. You may want it, and maybe somebody could run out and just grab. If you've got 5 to 10 people, you just need 1 sheet. If you've got 50, because I know some folks do, you may want, groups of 5, so you may want like 10 sheets. It's going to be activity later on, which you saw in the PowerPoint, called Principles of Community. And I just want to start that, where people will brainstorm, what do we expect of everyone if we had a magic wand, and what crosses a line. that activity plus probably 6 others that I'll mention could be great follow-up. And as you'll hear me say, and you saw in the writing, the whole point of this 3-hour virtual institute is to gather together current and potential white change agents from across your organization to just get a taste of what it could be like, and to see what's possible, and to realize they're not alone, and to realize there's work to do so that you or others can pull them back together. And there could be new people that come, the energy even from 5 people, if they each bring someone, and in 3 weeks you come back together. So that was my vision of just lots of pebble in the pond concentric circles. So if you keep that intention, that we're not going to be finished, but this is building a community of white change agents and the folks of color who attend, to realize they're not alone. If there are other folks of color, and also there are whites committed to this work, we're not there yet. We have a long way to go, but there could be some impact. There'll be a couple activities where I do say, especially the checklist you might have seen, the 1 through 41, the common racist behaviors of whites, that I'll gently invite people identified as multiracial, Native, monoracial, people of color to say, and, when do you see whites doing this? And you may, like other folks in my workshops, want to also glance to see if you've also internalized some of these white supremacist ideas and internalized racism. So I'll do a gentle offer, but your role, do not push any folk of color to look at themselves. This is not about internalized racism work. I'm hoping to have Dr. Tanya Williams do at least a live webinar, if not a virtual institute in the same process. That will be literally only for folks of color and folks that are multiracial and Native. We will really hold that. And that might be places where folks of color would have the bravery and safety to do their own work. But this is not the place to nudge or push. If folks of color do their work, that's different, but do not nudge. Yes, and I did say some white sheets of paper, probably 3/4 of the way in, or if you have a chart pad or a whiteboard. And you don't have to, you could just say you'll take notes and send them out, but it's, what do we want people to be doing? White behavior and white behavior that crosses a line. All right, I'm looking at the time. Okay. Again, if you have other questions, just pop them in. Your role mostly will be moving people in and out of groups. And even if I say, go find a new partner, if you're like, you think I've moved too much and your people are like, I'm not moving. So feel free to override me. And I do think part of this, particularly for the whites, is to meet a lot of other whites and have a chance to have multiple engagements. I am an ambivert. When I train, I'm more of an extrovert type trainer, in that I like people moving around, but people have reflection and one-on-one time mostly before they have to share in a large group. So that's for the reflective learners, I hope. Catherine Ferris is my colleague. I'll type her name in now. She will be live in the back channel. So if you have questions, wonders, I won't be looking at the chat and Q&A until you're in small groups. But then, because you'll be in, I'll bet a third, if not more of the time, will be work, if not, probably half. So I'll be able to look at it, but if in the meantime, if she finds something, especially if there's something going on in the chat or something, you're like, ooh, something popped in my group, just pop it in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be able to look at that. I just may not be able to do it immediately. I don't think I'm going to have time at the end of this for Q&A. I do have the slide. I timed it out this morning, and I'm like, ooh, there's 3.5 hours, and that's if everything goes as I planned. So I'll be cutting a little bit. I may not do a couple activities. We'll just see how things go. So I ask your grace and patience and just flexibility and willingness. I want your feedback. I think we'll send out a note to everybody that got a note from me yesterday. I'll send out a note, and I'd love your thoughts and feedback. As I said, I'm doing one of these a month, not on different, but on different topics. And do you have any questions about your role? I did write breakdown somewhere in here. I intend to offer a 5 to 7 minute, but feel free, I'll actually try to mention it, that if people want to take breaks at other times, if they want to do a reflection break, they got 2 minutes to think on something, they could move quickly to a restroom. The wrap-up time is a full 3 hour, and so I will honor that 3 hour. I am not sending out a recording of this. You have, and if you don't yet know in the emails I've sent, or you can email me, you have the recording of the webinar, which, to be honest, might be worth making sure everybody has that link in case they want to watch it, because if they're relatively new to this work, doing this plus listening to the webinar again might really help them move a little faster. I suggest you may want to stay around as you're cleaning up, because a few folks, especially at the end, we'll do some next steps. I'll give you a few moments to just say how many people want. You won't have 10 minutes, but you might have 5. How many people would like to gather again? Yep. How many folks would like to do these activities? I mean, you could do any of that. Raise your hand if, or you say, I'll send out a note. And I would encourage you to say, who's willing to help organize, so that you're not the one. But if 2 or 3 people are willing, you can spread that out. And to be honest, this is about expanding leadership, expanding responsibility, accountability. So the more you can get more folks, and you'll know enough as you meet people and see them in these 3 hours to know if you're like, yep, they could take this and run, or let's have them co-partner for the next gathering with you or somebody that you know has a greater depth. I did these, here's the real reason. Well, there's many. I've been 30 years on campuses, 35, and I get back to some campuses and other organizations that are still doing foundational training, and they haven't moved the needle very far. And I'm realizing at age 61, I'm not going to as many campuses because I'm doing more virtual, and I'm developing change agents and transformational leaders that want to do what I do and be out in the world. And so I was like, I want to do these virtual institutes. So I do workshops live with help. And then this material gets out, and it's like a jump start. So that's what each of these is about. The next one's on microaggressions. It'll be a jump start to then do more work on campuses. Because I believe if you find 5, 6, 20 people that want to keep moving, you might develop an ongoing professional development series for whites, a parallel one for folks of color, people multiracial, biracial. So the possibilities are endless. And with that, I think I just want to say thank you again. Let me look one more time at my notes. Oh, tell people they can eat, take a break whenever they want. I'll hang on in case you want to, or as you realize for the next 15 minutes, you have questions. Feel free, but if people are starting to wander in and you want to go greet or make sure everything's set up, feel free. I don't think I have anything else I intended to say. And I wish you well. Have an amazing virtual institute, and thank you again for your work in the world and your help today. All right. I'll also stay on a bit at the end, even as people are leaving, another 10, 15 minutes if people want to do some live chat. Or if you have more Q&A you want me to answer, like, okay, this happened, what would you have done? I think I have a good half hour I can do that. So not that you do, because this is a lot of time, but I will make that commitment. All right, my friends, I will see you in 15, and I will be here live in case you have more questions. Thank you. Hello, wherever you are in the world. Hello, I'm Kathy Obear, and I am just filled with just delight and gratitude for you showing up today. We're going to be looking at interrupting and dismantling racism, particularly our role as white agents, change agents, white allies, white accomplices, as we partner and follow the leadership of people of color, people that are multiracial, biracial, to really shift the organizational dynamics where we work and begin to maybe work in the community to do the work. I don't know about y'all. Every time I look at Facebook, every time I turn on the news, I'm reminded of how critical this work to create racial justice is, and how few whites are stepping up, speaking up, choosing courage to be a part of partnering to create change. Many whites might be showing up in arrogance and entitlement and taking over, as I have and could do in a split second if I go unconscious. And so the intent of today is to really support organizations to create more of a community of white change agents, allies, to do the next layer of work and commit to come back together regularly, whatever that looks like, to keep building our capacity so we do our part and do this work in partnership together. My hope is that in this webinar, you will gain more insight in how to build that community of white allies. We'll be doing 10 to 12 different activities. Again, this is an engaged interactive workshops, and you have site coordinators who will be moving you in and out of activities. We will have Tinkerbell. I don't know if you can see her, but I will do. They will be helping us come in and out of activities. And my hope, as I ask you to reflect, move into a dyad, a pair, or a small group, that you really challenge yourself to take an honest look, to really think differently. How do you engage others? How do you interact? How do you work? What you personally can do differently and what needs to shift in the organization across and within racialized identities. So when I said 10 to 12 activities, some of y'all might have looked at your watch and said in 3 hours. I intend this to be a smorgasbord. I intend this to be a place where I'll dip you in for 5 or 10, sometimes 15 minutes, a number of activities that literally you will come back to as you share this with colleagues or as you come back together as a group and do a deeper level. Some of these activities, you could spend 30, 40, 50 minutes just on one activity. And so I was trying to figure out how can I most be useful? I wanted to show you the full breadth that I do in a full day, maybe even a day and a half of work, activities that you can keep doing in white affinity groups, as well as cross-race groups, as well as people of color affinity groups. Now, the folks that have gathered with you may all identify as white, but every time I've done this workshop at a national conference, there have been a number, sometimes up to a third, people identify as people of color monoracial, folks of color biracial, multiracial, and folks that identify as indigenous, Native, Arab, Middle Eastern. So it could be that some of these activities, the folks who are marginalized by race might go, for this one, I want to be with someone who's also marginalized by race, another person of color, someone who's multiracial, biracial. And some folk who are marginalized by race may be like, I want to be with mixed race groups the whole time. And so my recommendation, and actually my ask, is that the folks of color and multiracial, biracial folks in the room are able to do however they want to do. And we'll just move forward. This is 3 hours. And so we will take a break. And there might be a moment where you're like, she's having us reflect for 2 minutes. I'm going to go do a reflection as I move to a restroom or as I go get something else to drink or pull out a sandwich. We are scanning many time zones. And so take care of yourselves and do whatever you need to do. And so with that, just want to highlight really quick, in these activities, you'll be able to identify more of the racist dynamics that occur every day around us. You'll recognize more of the impact, particularly in folks marginalized by racism, and how it impacts and undermines our organizational goals. My hope is you choose courage to speak up and interrupt the racist dynamics, and that you'll feel you're leaving with even more tools to share with others, because literally every activity is a tool. You could be hanging out in a room before a meeting and say, by the way, we got 10 minutes. I'd love to talk to you a bit more about your socialization. So every activity could be something you keep doing, and there'll be specific tools to interrupt racist dynamics in the moment or come back to them afterwards. So what I'd like you to do is go greet 4 to 5 people. Now, some of y'all are only 4 to 5 people, but if you have more than that, move around and go greet a few people, get some energy moving in the room. And in about 90 seconds, be ready to find a partner you don't know as well, because when you hear Tinkerbell, I'm going to ask you to get quiet, and site coordinators kind of help me. Raise your hand maybe, and everyone will bring it down. So go greet people, and then I'll bring you back to do something. If folks could begin looking around, find a partner you don't know as well. Site coordinators, you can just kind of make sure folks, and if you have one group of 3, that'll be fine because you may have an odd number of folk. So if people can begin to gather, you're welcome to be seated, standing. In about 10 seconds, I'll pull you back together. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Whenever you come back together, I invite you to take a deep breath. I'm going to be needing lots of deep breath. They're asking if I can turn up the volume. On my end, I'm as loud as I can go. So let's see if on your end you can go up any higher. What I'd like you to do with your partner, and I'll speak up a bit, is whether you're partner within or cross racial identities, what is your passion? Your commitment? Why is it important to you to develop communities across and within racial identities, to interrupt race dynamics when you see them that are unproductive and racist, to look at your policies and practices and dismantle any that are privileging whites and disadvantaging folks of color, and to truly create inclusive, socially just, racially just environments? The success of everyone is center stage and everyone's needs are centered. So literally just about 30, 45 seconds each, just take a deep breath and just talk a bit about why you're committed and why you have a passion, and just share the airtime. So I'm going to bring you back in about 10 seconds. Just kind of finish your last thought. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'd like you to take a deep breath and notice your body. Notice how you're feeling after talking about passion and commitment, even just for a couple minutes. Most folks talk about feeling a little more excited, maybe a little more anxious or nervous, but they're feeling more energy, and hearing someone else's passion be contagious. It might be that when you come back together, you spend more time really sharing everyone's passion, so you as a group hear why people are committed to doing racial justice work. But I know that if I forget my passion and I don't think about it, I can feel drained and exhausted, and I get all this white privilege, and so I can only imagine what it's like for folks who are marginalized by racism. I hope today you choose bravery and authenticity as we move into activities. We're about to move into some socialization activities, but throughout the 3 hours, just choose to be honest. And if you're willing to be honest, and honor confidentiality as people tell you stories or share things here, that together we'll get to a different level because you're willing to show up a little more authentic and brave and follow the leadership of others. I hope you had a chance to see my webinar. Aha, I'm getting some feedback about my windows. Hold on, I'm going to pull down the shades, see if that helps. Is that better? Hope so. So if you haven't had a chance to see the webinar, the free webinar, it might be interesting to watch after this. It may just reinforce some of these points. I'm going to be walking us through activities at the individual level, recognizing that that's not sufficient. We have to track group dynamics around us, and then organizational level, looking at the culture, the climate, white cultural dynamics. And so individually, we can remove some of the blocks. This is kind of the pyramid of racism and oppression. When we do our own work, we can remove some of the blocks, but it's going to take a lot more work at the group and organizational level to keep going. So at the individual level, you're still with the same partner, I hope. I'm going to be asking you to think about your own individual story around socialization. And whether you are identifying as a white person or person of color, I'd like you to reflect on these questions. And I'll give you a couple minutes. You have the handouts. I hope you have a writing utensil. You may want to draw a couple pictures. You may want to just make a couple notes, or just reflect and be willing to share in a couple minutes. Now, I don't intend you to do all 4 of these. In fact, maybe just pick one, and you might do a different one with your partner. But individually choose one. Do you want to talk about when you remember being told there were different races, or maybe what were your experiences interacting with people of different racialized groups, and just pause and go, oh, when was that? Or how were people of your race, racialized identity, and other racialized groups treated, depicted, talked about? And then finally, what were the messages around you and the different racialized groups? So just take a moment, maybe just prepare 1 or 2, reflect on these. I'll give you about 90 seconds to reflect, and then a few moments to then turn and talk back to the same partner. Just some quiet time. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What I'd like you to do is turn to your partner. Hope that was enough time to reflect. And each of you just share a little bit about 1 or 2 of these, just for about a minute and a half each, just a little bit of your socialization. Go ahead. Oh, they're talking about the chat room. About one more minute, one more minute. Five, four, three, two, one. Everybody take a deep breath. My guess is you were just getting started and could see how this could be a 20-minute conversation. And on page 3 of the handouts, there's actually even more conversation starters that you could have when you pull back together, or you want to use this in your staff teams or with other white groups and folks of color coming together to do some work and healing work around race. For the next piece, we're going to do another level of socialization. This often takes people to a much deeper level. And I'd like you, if you didn't already, to use this tool to say as a, and just name how you identify racially. And site coordinators, I'm going to skip this debrief and just move right into this next one and have you debrief them both together. And so on the bottom of page 4 are some other authentic dialogue prompts that I've had for years when I've done white affinity groups. We're going to be doing the bottom 2, which, to be honest, is where I start when I am really just trying to work folks that have already been doing a lot of good work on themselves. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to stay with the same partner because you've developed, I think, some connection already, and answer one or both of these questions, and I'll answer them quickly to just give you a flavor. A time when you remember you realized that whites as a group, I'm not saying all whites, but whites as a group believed they were superior to folks of color, people of multiracial, biracial. Thought whites were smarter, more professional, better leaders, had greater competencies. People of color were deficit, just those horrific racist white supremacist attitudes that are alive and well today. When do you realize it's like, whoa. So I grew up in the 60s outside Washington, D.C., and so I remember watching on TV Bull Connor down in, I believe, Alabama, and the hoses by those police, and just really abusing and targeting and assaulting marchers, all African-American to my memory. And I remember thinking that those whites, those racists, those KKK, white supremacists, and I remember believing that there were a lot of them. So I don't believe that all whites did, but I sure believe that whites in general. As I got older and I studied Dr. King, and I realized that there were a lot of whites that were around me that had racist thoughts. They weren't down in the South as I first believed. But again, as I mentioned in the webinar, I, of course, wasn't one of those other whites. But I did realize early that whites thought we were here and people of color. But my attitude came with that kind of a patronizing, we have to help the people of color. So it's racist as hell, but it has that kind of self-righteousness in there. So that's a quick story about number 1, when you remember the whites as a group. And then you may want to also choose bravery and tell a story when you realize that you still believed whites were smarter, better. And a short version of the story, I went out to dinner with a person of color I didn't know very well. And turned out everybody, with 12 people sitting at a table, all people of color. I was the only white person. So I was engaging, and all of a sudden we were talking about chaos theory and physics and some books they'd read that were literature, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And I was shocked that these 12 folks of color were smarter than I was. And I'm embarrassed to be saying it even after I've told this story probably 20 times, but that was the truth. And so I was tripping over the white supremacist racist belief that whites are smarter, better. And I'd met one or two people of color I thought were as smart, but to be so confronted by so many people of color that clearly were smarter than me and had done more work than me, and just, it was a mirror to go, oh, I still believe that whites are better. And I had, again, this condescending, there are a couple people of color that are at my level. So I encourage you to choose bravery. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect, to make some notes, and I'm going to ask you to turn back to your partner. At a minimum, when do you remember, whites in general? But then, wow, when I was 10, 15, 20, 30, I was in my 40s when that happened, 45 probably, when I realized how much I was still believing whites were smarter. So just take a moment to reflect. In about 30 seconds, when you and your partner are ready, you can start telling stories. You'll have about 3 minutes to tell some quick stories. About 1 more minute to share, 1 more minute. Please start finishing up your share. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. Whew. So site coordinators, what I'd like you to do is take a couple minutes and ask people just to notice how they're feeling, especially sharing that last part when they realize as whites at the group level, or they personally, someone who identified as white, believed whites, or as a person of color, they still believed whites were smarter. Just ask for impact or what's going on in their bodies, and what was the impact of hearing someone else share, honestly. So collect up a few voices, please. A couple minutes. Just about 30 more seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Everybody take a deep breath. You may want to lean over and thank your partner for sharing. When I've done this and asked this question probably 50 different times, many whites will say, I felt embarrassed, I felt guilt and shame, I've never told that story to anyone. And then some will say, I felt relief to be able to have someone else who will also tell me a story, just felt gratitude they told me, and that gave me permission to get more honest. And then a number of whites say, and I also feel a heaviness because this was just the beginning. There's a lot to unpack. And so literally those two questions could be things you journal about, come back in white affinity spaces and continue sharing new stories, and personally just keep digging and finding more and more stories, because the more you can find those stories and let go of the guilt and shame and just honor the truth of what you were taught in socialization, how you absorbed it, and maybe still act out of it, that's when we can show up much more effective as whites. What we've been doing is necessary but not sufficient. If we're only focused on the individual level, our socialization, making sure we're taking our racist thoughts and we're trying to shift those and not act on them, that's critical. If you need a space, I know I mentioned when I took the Harvard Project Implicit Bias test, I was shocked and a little irritated at how racially biased it said I was. And it was another wake-up call. And the truth was, I know I have these racist attitudes. And there's so many, not only just black, white, but so many other different other racialized identities, and other marginalized identities. So really encourage you to add this into your personal practice as well as maybe share it and have your whole team take it and talk about it. Again, work at the individual level makes a minor difference, but look how much of the racism is still embedded into our daily life if we don't move on to the group level. And so, yes, we have to look at our racist attitudes, shift them, keep learning and unlearning, but we have to really, as whites, put much of our energy on the systems and the group level. And so that's where I want to go. I'm going to do it in a couple different ways. And the first, if you please turn to page 5, the only way I can recognize racist dynamics around me is if I'm consciously centered, first of all, but then observing with what I call a race or an inclusion lens. And on page 5, there's a list of about 21 tools and skills that help me, if I'm conscious. Some people actually write these out on a post-it and have it in a meeting in front of them, so they think, who's interrupting who gets more airtime, whose ideas are followed up, whose aren't. And so I want you to think about, on page 5, this is all called panning, pay attention now. And it's that skill of, you saw in the book, to be able to get out of yourself and to notice around you what's going on, the group dynamics, and observe, but also notice yourself. And so those tools, what I'd like you to do individually is maybe between you and your current partner, one start at the top and one start at the bottom. Or if you're like, we've talked a lot and there's a lot of people in the room, we want to get a new partner, but just do it in like 5 seconds. 2 people, maybe one start reading 1 and one start down at 21. Check off the tools you commonly use with a race lens. And what I mean is you're not noticing by gender identity. You're not noticing by age. You're not noticing only by hierarchical level or sex assigned at birth. You're noticing, are the white folks getting more attention? Is the topic about how white people are feeling or how it's going to impact whites? When a person of color brought up the impact of something, did whites come in and start doing, yeah, but that wasn't my intent? So you notice the content. So I'll get quiet now. Star the ones you want to add to your toolkit, but with a race lens. What do you notice? Privileged, marginalized by race. Take about 30 seconds. Just look through and see which ones you know and which ones you want to add. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Deep breath. Just for 45 seconds, turn to your partner and each share 2 tools that you use with a race lens, things you notice, what race dynamics, and maybe 2 you want to pay more attention to. Just turn and quickly highlight a couple each. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come on back. My hope is you realize you might already be panning with a race lens and that there are a couple other tools you could use. Some people literally take this and Xerox it and give it to everybody on their team and talk about how we need to be paying attention to our group dynamics with a race lens, and then you can broaden it to every other category of difference. But we have to be paying attention or we cannot notice the daily dynamics that leave our colleagues of color feeling diminished, demoralized, they don't belong, racist dynamics that just tear at their soul and literally their body. So please turn to page 6 and 7. Now at this point, you may want to find a new partner. I like to mix people up, but you can decide what you want to do. What you have here are some what I call unproductive meeting and classroom behaviors that some people may not call microaggressions in the traditional sense, but these dynamics are happening in every meeting I've ever known, every training I've ever known. And when they happen to anybody, they're painful. So you could have two white women who are 61-year-old out lesbians, and we do these to each other. We interrupt, we take each other's ideas, we have side conversations when the person's looking. I give them the cold shoulder or silent treatment. These are painful among similar identity group, similar privilege. But when it's from someone in privilege to someone marginalized, from a white person to someone who's native, from a white person to someone who's biracial, multiracial, monoracial, Latino, Asian American, native, the pain is significant and the impact is significant. And especially someone like me with multiple privileged identities, I get interrupted, I'm irritated, but it doesn't re-trigger the cumulative impact of my personal life as well as the life of family and the generations of racism that can get re-traumatized in one split second. It's just hard to understand if you're not a member of a significantly marginalized group. So I'm going to interrupt that, of a marginalized group. All marginalized groups are significantly marginalized. So I'd like you to do, between you and your partner, one person do page 6 and one person do page 7. What I'd like you to do is be thinking not only race as I've been talking about it, but some of the intersectional identities that often play in as we're in meetings. Because someone that's very light-skinned and African-American might get differently treated than someone that's very dark-skinned and Latina, who also might have a Spanish accent. Someone that's from Indonesia, immigration status, green card, medium dark skin, different experience than maybe someone who's biracial, multiracial, someone who is from Pakistan who wears a hijab. So you may want to say, so take a moment and reflect. Look at your sheet when you've seen white people do these things in meetings and what's been the impact at a minimum across to a person of color, someone biracial, multiracial. But if you can come in and think about these different identities as well, to just complicate it. And someone says in Virginia Tech, they're having trouble hearing. How are other people doing with hearing? If you have a moment to let us know. Seems to be good other places, so thank you all. So take about 90 seconds individually just to look at your page, and then I'll have you turn to your partner and you'll get a chance to share. Just about 30 more seconds to reflect. Five, four, three, two, one. Now, I'd like you to do is turn to this partner and share, no names, not even what department or even when it happened, but each share 2 or 3 unproductive dynamics that you saw that, as you think about it with a racial lens, what was the probable impact when a white person did this? A quick example, I just happened to look down, number 22. I know I've done that one. When folks of color, colleagues and friends of mine have confronted me on some racist behavior they experienced, I know I've not only gotten defensive, white fragility, but I have gotten this passionate to argue why I wasn't racist, raise my voice to try to end the conversation. I may not have been intentionally trying to silence, but that was just below the surface. I wanted the conversation to go away because I was right and they were wrong. So talk about when you've seen these and what's the probable impact. I'll just give you a couple minutes, each share 1 or 2, 3. Go ahead. About 10 more seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. I used this worksheet yesterday. It was breadth of differences, but we had race very centered. And many people said it was a very helpful worksheet. A man of color, black man, actually said it puts words to what I'm feeling. I was really impacted by that. And other folks said, I see I can take this back, share this handout with everybody that I work with, just to be aware of the daily dynamics that are happening. Because many people will say, I don't see race, I don't see racial microaggressions, because they think it has to be one of those blatant experiences. And while those are horrific, These daily, it's like someone had this metaphor, 1,000 paper cuts. And I don't know about you, but one paper cut ruins my day. It's just painful. It's hard for me to work, right? And if these are just happening all, so helping people realize that this concept of microaggressions can come up in many ways. The topic does not have to be race. It can be how we interact across privileged, marginalized identities. And so you may know that Dr. Chester Pierce in 1970, I'm told, coined the term microaggression. And then you may know, more familiar as I am, with Dr. Daryl Sue's work, his book and many writings, and he's got some videos on YouTube to help people understand this concept. On page 8 are some of his, Dr. Sue's, reflections. So if people like conceptual, you have that handout. It's those daily microaggressions, those indignities that happen all around us, similar to what you just read, but you're going to read some more. I find individually it's helpful for me to read and hear situations that people of color experience every day and from other white people. So let me be clear, I'm not asking people of color to teach whites. In fact, this activity can help whites get the voices of people of color in the room, as well as what whites have observed. You collect those up. You either share them like I have here in a minute, which will be in 2 pages, or you could have them each written out on a piece of paper and people read them aloud. By the way, I'm doing, as I said, one a month of these virtual institutes. In June, I'll do one on just basic foundational diversity training, and I'll teach a skill called Gallery, a tool I use. I'll also talk about that in April and May when I'm doing in Creating Inclusive Organizations, Systemic Change Work, parts 1 and 2. And it's a way to collect up qualitative anecdotal stories. Recognize microaggressions. What I'd like you to do is get into groups of 3. So don't look at the slide, just if the site coordinator can mix people up into new groups of 3. And if you have groups of 4, the 4th person can be a D, and they just can read any 10. So we'll be looking at pages 9 and 10. And as you gather into triads, what I'd like you to do is, I don't know if you count off, letter off, assign each person a different letter, A, B, C. If you have 4 people, D. If you have 5 people there, figure it out. My intent is, of the 30 microaggressions here that are racist, racial microaggressions, I'd like each person to just read 10. And then you'll have a small group to share which ones stood out and looked familiar to you. So here's how it's going to work. A's, you're going to read 1 to 10 on page 9. B's, you're going to read 11 to 20, a little on both pages. C's, you're going to read 21 to 30. And if you have an extra person or 2, just read a little bit out of each of those 10 groups of 10. As you read, just notice which look familiar. And are there any others that are coming to mind? Because the ones you think about are actually maybe more powerful to share. After about 90 seconds of looking at your 10, you're going to have a chance to share in this triad. So just take a moment, reflect on your assigned, and then be ready to share 2 or 3 in a moment. Five, four, three, two, one. I love Tinkerbell. Take a deep breath. I apologize. I meant to say that these are what I've collected from college campuses, but the folks that are out in the Girl Scouts in Western Washington, those that are in the K-12 system in Washington State, and those that are in some of these community organizations that are also on the call. My guess is you've seen these happening in your organization as well as your community. And thanks for translating words that don't quite fit your organization. So I'd like you to do now in your group of 3 or more, each person share, you know, I said 3 to 5. I'm thinking 2 to 3 that looked familiar, particularly any others that you've observed in the organization. But let me be very clear. I want no names, not even a time frame. Just say, here's why. If you say, remember that meeting last week? This happened. If you do that, people might think, yeah, and it was an isolated incident. But if you say, I've been in several meetings recently and before, and I've seen this dynamic, that will help the other whites or folks of color reflect that it's a broader dynamic than just an isolated incident. I don't know if you've done this as a white person, but I sure have wanted to explain it away with a perfectly logical explanation. So, what have you seen happen in your organization or community? Thanks for translating any words that don't fit to your organization. About 3 minutes, so each person has a minute or two just to quickly share 1 or 2 that look familiar. About 1 more minute. 1 more minute. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take a deep breath. So now I'm going to invite the site coordinators to lead a 3 or 4 minute debrief and insights, reflections from both the unproductive meeting behaviors as well as the more, what I think definitionally people would call microaggressions, though I've been told there's some in there people would call macroaggressions. Let me just say one quick thing. The term micro, I'm noticing more people are bumping into. They're saying there's nothing micro about these. And so I want to honor the language that's being used, as well as also honor that any one of these could be a huge negative impact and trigger on folk. Just clear messages: you don't belong, you're not good enough. So as you debrief, you might find, as I do, is as you're talking about insights, reflections, or what's the impact of looking at these documents and having the conversations, some folks will say, I've done some of these. And so I want to nudge folks, if you're willing to get honest, I've probably done every single one of those unproductive meeting behaviors as a white person impacting negatively a person of color. So, and some of the racist microaggressions as well. So I encourage you, as you just have a couple moments, 2, 3, 4 minutes. Thanks, site coordinators. Have a conversation.
Kathy, we have a quick question. Somebody wants to know if you want them to send you what they're sharing out as a whole group at some point.
No, that's okay. About 1 more minute. 1 more minute. So 10 more seconds. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take a deep breath. I just want to thank folks that were getting honest with themselves about the microaggressions and unproductive behaviors you may have done that as a white person negatively impacted others. When I first started to realize that, it was pretty shocking because, of course, you've heard my story. Whites that were the problem were other people. And to begin to realize that my behavior, fueled by my own socialized racist beliefs and white supremacist attitudes, were also either why I stayed quiet or why I perpetuated race dynamics that were ineffective. That's a hard moment. And so I hope you're finding support and people are relating in, or if you didn't even say it, but you're just asking yourself that as you share with other whites later, that you ask them, have you ever done this too? So you notice you're not alone. I think this is the most critical point for whites in our development, to go from trying to fix and change others, that social justice arrogance, I'm the right one and let me fix you, to what am I doing, how am I perpetuating, how am I colluding, and what do I need to do to change my behavior, and how do I engage other whites effectively, not I'm right, you're wrong, let me show how good I am. So I just wanted to also add a few more. These are some I've heard recently and I didn't update. So just recently I was on a campus and someone said to them, I don't see you as Latino, I just see you as a person. I have no doubt I've said something like that in my life. Or search chair, just yesterday they said, you know, they'd be a good fit. I don't think it's supposed to say I think they'd be a good fit, meaning about white people or about a person of color. I don't think they'd be a good fit. I've had whites say I feel discriminated against as a white person. This is reverse racism. So what will you do, or what have you done in those situations? Or a white person asking someone, where are you really from? Well, I'm from Texas. Well, no, where are you really from? Assuming it's Nicaragua or Philippines. Speak English, go back where you came from, especially in this context with all the xenophobia that's coming from the very top in this current administration and full breadth of people in that organization. To be aware of the intersections of how race plays out and talk about what happens in our environment, what happens in the community that impacts our colleagues. So when they come to work, they're already triggered maybe and impacted. And as a white ally and accomplice, what can I do in those moments? And so if you're like me, I do these. So what I want to invite you to do is be looking around, and how many people who identify as white and of color, you might do this too, but I'm not going to nudge you, but you may want to. How many folks go into fight mode? But it's that fight, I'm going to take you out and put you in your place or show you. I know as a white person, I just took many whites out because then I looked like the good white. How many folks freeze? I've done that. I can still do it if it's something I've not seen before. Or I'm in a situation that I'm not in charge and I'm like, how do I navigate this? So I might freeze for a moment, and that leads to flounder. I'm like, do I try this? Do I try that? And I stumble over myself. And I have done flight, silent shut down, which feels a little different than freeze because I'm not even trying. And I've literally wanted to leave, or I have left. And it could be picking up my phone or turning and having a side conversation. I just disengage. So my hope is that either as you made noise or raised your hand as you identify with those 4 F's, that you realized you're not alone. And there's so many reasons we have these stress reactions, but one is we don't know what to do. And another is we've just been socialized and allowed to have unproductive common reactions. So if you please turn to page 16. I've done all of these. It's not a complete list, but I'd like you individually, please, again, either from your privileged or marginalized, racialized identity, in difficult moments where there's race dynamics, racist systems, dynamics going on, how many of these have you ever done? Now, so y'all might be thinking, getting in there aggressively arguing, debating might be exactly what's needed. And occasionally it might be. But I find in our privileged identities, most whites, when we're doing that, we're going to statistics and facts and this energy of I'm right, you're wrong, and no learning is happening. So it might interrupt the moment, but I'm into interrupting and educating to get changed behavior. And so if you want behavior change in the short and long term, I personally believe most of these are not helpful. So take a couple minutes, go to your general stress releases, start there, and just check off how many of these have you done, and add any more.
Kathy, we got a request for a little bit more time for discussion during these breaks.
Thank you. Five, four, three, two, one. We're getting a couple requests for more time for conversation. I'm excited by that. I'll see what I can do. But this would be a time you can turn to one person you've not talked to yet, choose authenticity, and tell some stories, quick stories, examples of when you responded ineffectively, unproductively, when you've been re-triggered into your 4Fs, the stress reaction. So, or just claim these are some of the inappropriate ways that I have responded that are not helpful. Take a moment or two. About 30 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you want, I just got an idea. Why don't you high five some people, even if it's air high fives, to thank them for getting honest about their unproductive reactions. So if it works energetically, take a quick moment to thank people however you want to. I want to be effective. I want to be a change agent that makes a difference and comes out of an energy of humility, selfless service, and usefulness. And my intentions are, I want to respond in ways that interrupt the racist dynamics, and I want to do in a way that others feel engaged and met and left feeling whole, so they'll reflect on their own impact and the racist dynamics they had and what were their intentions. Because not everybody will come to a workshop like this. And so how do you, in your one-on-one interactions as you move forward, engage people in ways that educates why their comment crossed a line, the behavior, the policy has a racist impact? Because most whites will shut down, freeze. And so to be able to engage others in ways that energetically feel like you're meeting people where they are and you're not trying to be better than them, you're not trying to judge or criticize, you just want to change the behavior. And for me, especially in organizations, I think we have an ethical responsibility as whites to build connections and relationships with other whites and have this ongoing dialogue. I'm delighted people want more time, and every activity you wanted more time with, you can pull back together and do some lunch and learns and just slow it down and have more conversation and bring more people into the dialogue. That does bring up an idea I hadn't thought of. The folks that are participating today will have lots more information and even some deeper self-work. I encourage you to share it widely, because if not, people will start to see that a group of whites now think they're up here and the rest of the whites are down here, and they'll feel that you become cliquey. So if you haven't already found ways to share this in open forums or in other workshops, I encourage you to do that. On page 17, I believe, I just want to give a big shout out to Naomi Sig, Case Western Reserve, Director of Office of Multicultural Affairs. Came up with this model. We were working together and she's like, we need a model. And I just couldn't come up with one. And I was suggesting words and she's like, oh, it spells address. And so I love this because as whites, we need to address racist dynamics, interpersonal dynamics that we see at the group level happening around us. So these are the intent. Do you want to acknowledge it? Start a dialogue. Some you may need to document so that we start a paper trail. Use a bias response and or someone's personnel file. You may want to redirect the conversation. There's 2 minutes left in the conversation in the meeting and you're like, I don't think we can go there now, but you can still acknowledge it and then redirect and say, we'll come back to this. As I mentioned, educating, clearly stopping, intervening. I used the word interrupt. The last aspect was how do you impacted by the racist dynamic. And so this in itself would be an activity that you do in some follow-up. I just wanted to highlight and call out Naomi. By the way, she does workshops and trainings and speaking on campuses. So if you want me to connect you, just let me know. The tools that I find people really respond to well, you may have seen already. Somebody's talking about a weird warble. Oh, it's better now. Okay. It might be me moving. On page 18, pairs. When I do workshops, I give people 20 pages of activities, but I find that's way too much skills and tools, so I've just given them this page and they find it useful. And so I'm going to do this and then give you a break, I think. What I'm envisioning is that over the break in a moment, you'll be thinking about one of those microaggressions and what you could have done in the moment. Because when you come back from break, I'm going to put you with one. I'll let the site coordinator decide if your group is doing better in pairs because that's more airtime, or if your group likes the diversity of ideas with 3 or 4 people, you get to decide. But after the break, you're going to come back and maybe choose one microaggression in a group and think about how could you have panned, asked a question, what could you have said to interrupt, how could you have related in as a way to create dialogue, How could you share it as a way to build connections and deepen understanding, build community? I want to use an example to show this, and then I will give you a break to kind of be reflecting on this. So again, pairs is on page 18. What I have here is Kathy O'Bear speak. And so more and more people are saying, I could never say it that way, but I hope you find the essence of these skills. So here's the situation. I'm imagining I'm a white student that's talking to a white faculty member. I'm in social work, or I want to be in social work. And what I'm noticing is there's nothing in all my classes that's really helping me get competent around working with people who are Native and Native American. And that's one of my ideas. I have friends who are Native. This is all hypothetical, by the way. I live in northern Minnesota, and I do know that in an internship that I did, there are Native American families, and I didn't know what to do. And so I'm going to talk to my major advisor and a faculty member that teaches a couple of the key courses. And I might pan and I say, my guess is you've noticed too, but I've been noticing I've taken 4 courses so far in my major, and I haven't read or no discussions about Native American Indigenous folk. And I'm really wanting much more information to prepare me as I want to be working up here in northern Minnesota. Have you noticed the same thing? So you noticed. I used a noticing or a pan, pay attention now. I used that as the intervention. Then I asked a question just to gently get them in the conversation. So I might ask a question that'd be, I'm only taking a few courses. Are there other courses where Native American dynamics, issues, genocide, current racist dynamics are talked about so that I could get some better understanding and skills? Especially if I anticipate this white faculty member might be defensive. I might say, so I'll bet you can relate. I might jump to relate. I bet you can relate to what it might be like to not seeing yourself in the coursework. I know as a queer identified person, I often am the only one to bring up LGB, much less transgender issues. Even though I'm cisgender, I still bring them up. And so can you relate to what it must be like for some of the colleagues that are in the classes with me that are Native American, that don't see themselves? If the faculty member said something like, you know what, as they look at their watch, we'll think about it, but we really need in this meeting to talk about your graduation requirements. I was noticing that you are missing a couple classes. Then I might interrupt. I might say, I might pan and interrupt, and I might say, so I appreciate that because I really do want to graduate. But I would still like to go back and talk. I noticed we shifted. And I still would like to go back and talk about what could you imagine? Who could I talk to get more information into our coursework about how to better serve Native Americans and address the racism? And finally, and again, not in any order, but a share might be, I might have started with that. The story might be, as a queer identified person, I know what it's like to just not see myself in the coursework. And over 4 classes, I've noticed I haven't seen or learned a thing unless I've brought it up or I did my own research around Native American. And as a white person, I'm actually feeling I'm not getting the competencies I need. So can you help me figure this out as we look at how do I graduate, but also get these? So sharing a story, sharing the impact, sharing a feeling. I hope that was useful to see how you could take one moment that could be, it's based on a series of microaggressions and you're trying to engage change, and how to use these tools of engagement, pairs the acronym. So with that, let's do a 7-minute stretch, 1 function bio break, do whatever you need to do. And while you're doing that, be thinking about, is there a situation I want to meet with someone and walk through using pairs? Or you just may need a break and you'll just go along with what everybody else asks for. So let's take 7 minutes and then we'll come on back. We'll start in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. We'll start in 1 minute. 1 minute. Five, four, three, two, one. Welcome back from break. We're halfway through. Here's what I'd like the site coordinators to do. Either have people in new pairs, or if you want to be in a small group, and we'll have enough time for maybe one person to say, here's a microaggression, and let's use pairs. How could we pan, ask, interrupt, relate, and share, and come up with at least one example at each of those sets of tools? If someone's in a group and you can't think of a microaggression, you can just do, what if someone tells a racist joke? You're in a meeting before it starts, and someone tells a joke that for you crosses a line. What could you do in that moment? And so I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to, in some pairing, no pun intended, think about how could you use these tools on page 18 for a specific. And you might come up short, but try to find one for each. So go ahead and take 4 minutes. About one more minute. One more minute. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. Give me a single clap. I know I won't hear it, but other people will. If while brainstorming each of those, you got an idea or two from one of your colleagues on how you might interrupt and engage during a racist dynamic. 1, 2, 3, clap. My hope is there are some claps in the room, but more important, that process you just did, you can repeat over and over again when you come back together, as well as in any staff group, if you're working with faculty. Just pick a difficult moment, a racist dynamic. What could you do? And just take all 5 of these skills plus others and just brainstorm to give people more confidence that they have a variety of skills and tools, and there's not just one right way to respond. So we've been working at the individual and the group level. It is critical that we look and find microaggressions, we interrupt them, unproductive meeting behaviors, we engage, we interrupt them, we see our behaviors in ourselves, but it is critical that we do a deeper level of work, and this is what I think is the centerpiece of white affinity work generally, and that's to begin to look at internalized dominance. And that's a jargon term that's come out maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, or at least that's when I started hearing about it. But the idea of the racist and white supremacist attitudes that we've absorbed that we may not even know we have. Some people use the term implicit bias. I like internalized dominance because it really acknowledges that we're coming from this place of superior and dominance, and these attitudes that literally people don't even know they have, maybe just below the surface or even deeper, are fueling our behaviors. And so we're going to be working with pages 11 and 12 for about the next 15 or 20 minutes. And this is where I think you can have increasingly authentic dialogue, and you'll have a bit more time to do that. But this next conversation you could do when you come back together, and each time you do it, I've probably been in these conversations 50 to 80 times. And each time I'm just reminded of what I'm currently doing that's rooted in white supremacist attitudes and how my current racist behaviors are impacting colleagues of color. And so it's just a powerful way to hold myself accountable and create a culture of accountability with other whites. So, would you please turn to pages 11 and 12. If you identify as white, I want you to do 2 parts. Check off, and you're looking at numbers 1 through 44. Page 13 has some more effective ways to engage. We're only going to look at the 1 through 44 that I think are racist, common racist behaviors with the attitudes that are fueling them. Check off the ones you've seen or heard or observed from other whites. You're like, oh yeah, I've seen whites do this, and just check them off. Then I'd like you to star the dynamics you have personally done or the attitudes you've felt or the feelings you felt. I have starred each one of these, and twice a year at the Social Justice Training Institute, if not more often, I go through this while I'm asking the folks in the White Affinity Caucus to do the same. Humbling, a little frightening, and frustrating at how even after I do all this work on myself and I teach this work, if I go unconscious, not paying attention, I can be reacting out of these racist beliefs in a split second. So I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes individually. Now, if you identify as a person of color, multiracial, biracial, you can definitely do 1, if not 2. Definitely, I encourage you to check off how many times you've seen whites do this. Now, some whites and folks of color have actually used multiple check marks. Check mark, I've seen it, 4 or 5, it's pretty common. Can actually be a stress releaser. I remember one colleague of color, when I first developed this about 10 or 12 years ago, he looked at it and he took it, he said, I know this stuff happens, but the impact of seeing them all at the same moment was pretty powerful. So I don't know what your experience will be as a person of color. And some folks of color, multiracial, biracial folks also say, you know what, I'm going to star too, because in this white supremacist socialization, folks of color were socialized to believe these same beliefs. And we call that internalized racism. It's not racism, it's the internalized beliefs that's the work that Dr. Tanya Williams does. So you may or may not want to, but if you want to glance and go, how many of these behaviors have I done either in horizontal hostility, how's that for another jargon word, but within a group of color or to other groups of color that are marginalized by race, or have perpetuated dynamics. So it's a gentle offering, but no expectation. And for sure, if you do that, I would encourage you to be partnered up with another person of color as you're sharing, but you get to make your own choices. So again, 3 or 4 minutes. Definitely everybody do 1 through 41. Have you observed them whites? And whites, when have you personally done them? Choose bravery, authenticity. 3 or 4 minutes, go. You're about halfway. About 30 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. And how about one more deep breath? I don't care how many times I look at this list, it's still difficult to look myself in the mirror and see how many of these I've been thinking, almost did, and have done recently. How far I still need to go. So I want to thank you for your willingness to do that. The next step, I really want to encourage you to choose bravery. And site facilitators, you may want to do this as a full group if you have a small enough group, 5 to 10 people. You may find that your group would prefer to do it in 3s or 4s. So you all get to make that decision. You can actually be organizing while I tell you how it's going to work and model. How it's going to work is one person who's going to say, I'll go first. And they'll say, like, I've seen number 15, and then read it. People have different learning styles, so read it into the room. I've seen whites, want people of color to get over it and move on quickly. Now, if you're facilitating, you could also say, how many people have seen that one? Who relates? The next person to share, because the first person may give a brief example, may not. The next person to share, this is critical, has to relate in. And so this is what it could sound like if it was me. I so relate. I not only have seen that, I have done that. I remember when a person of color, colleague of mine, confronted me on some of my racist behavior. I wanted them to get over it, move on quickly. I was yeah-butting. And I'm like, give me a break. It was a minor misstep, given everything else I've done in the world. You're focused on this. That's what was going on inside me. My energy was, let's move. And I did not want to slow down at all to hear my impact and my behavior. So I've not only done that one, but I've also, number 25, I have seen whites, but I have rephrased and reworded the comments of people of color. And I hate it when I still do it, but I get that what's underneath it is I still think I'm right, or I can, if I say it better, other whites could hear me. And under that is that belief that whites are smarter. And so I've done that one too. Then when I pause, the next person comes in would relate. Kathy, I've seen whites do that, and I've done number. So I hope that quick role play showed you. First person shares with or without an example helps, but they got to be brief. Quantity is useful here. Second person relate in, connect, and then share a different item. The next person relate, share a different item. And if it were me, I'd be asking at each point, can anybody else relate? Have you seen this? Have you done it? Just so you realize you're not alone. So with that, what I want to do is leave the site coordinators to organize folks. And I'm thinking a good 8 minutes, which may not sound like a lot, but I think every person in a small group can share at least 2 or 3 and relate in. Keep the story short. So I'm going to set for 8, and we'll see what happens. You're about halfway, halfway. About 1 more minute. 1 more minute. Five, four, three, two, one. If you're like me, I always need a couple deep breaths after I get this honest and engage with other whites. So take a deep breath. And one more. What I want to invite the site coordinators to do is just hear out from a few people. Impact of hearing other folks own and share they've seen these, and especially hearing other whites say, I've done this, I've thought this. I can't think of one, but I know I must have. So just take a couple minutes, maybe hear from 3, maybe 4 people quickly. Go ahead. About 30 seconds. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When you come back together in future affinity groups, I would really emphasize this worksheet and having people talk about what they've currently seen and what they've currently felt or done. The more whites in a community, a learning community of accountability, can talk and share without judgment, blame, shame, just like, here's what I've done and here's what I commit to doing differently. Here's what I noticed, and then I came back and had this conversation. My guess is, even in that 2-minute debrief, some folks said, these are hard to see and admit, but there's some relief or freedom in realizing I don't have to hide, but I have a group of whites that if we really commit to coming back together and getting honest and vulnerable over time, this could be a community of accountability where I can say, here's what I'm thinking and help me. What could I have done differently? Help me unpack that. And I really know for me personally, in this part of White Caucuses, when other whites get honest and share and tell me a story of what they've done and that was racist, it just helps me see myself. And so instead of judging, oh, I can't believe, it's like, ooh, how am I just like you? And so I hope you did that as people were sharing and as you continue to use this worksheet as a stimulus for future conversations. Many whites will say they don't feel as alone or isolated and lonely, and they realize there's a community of whites they can come together with to decide how they want to work together, create change, partner with folks of color. Take another deep breath. Whew. Please turn to page 14. Because no matter how far down the road you've gone, you can always turn around. You make a mistake today, you can make amends and commit to doing different and do better tomorrow. And these small, seemingly insignificant steps, these different activities repeated with different people over time consistently, you'll start to see some radical difference in you and in meetings and in trainings, because more and more whites will have courage and skills to speak up instead of folks of color being overburdened with that labor tax, emotional tax of being the only ones to speak up. We can be doing our part. And so on page 14, the middle and the top are some questions that really help me when I'm in one of those moments and I've just thought that person of color isn't very bright, and the circumstance was they stumbled over their words or mispronounced a word. I can say, is it true, really true, that they're not as smart? What's my evidence? Any of these questions will stop me and interrupt my racist thoughts, and particularly the middle one. When whites have stumbled, misspoke, when I have misspoke and stumbled, do I have the same thought, oh, they're not as smart, as I do sometimes with folks of color? And so having these before a meeting, before workshops, just reflecting on them and reflecting on the last two, how does it serve me to think whites are smarter and better? How does it help me think I'm still superior and better? Hard questions, but you do the best till you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. Dr. Maya Angelou. These questions with yourself or with one other trusted person or in a community of whites can help us all get better. And again, our behaviors are like the leaves and the limbs. We have to look at the roots. We have to keep digging down in those internalized messages. And so to be asking ourselves, what are the racist beliefs that are fueling why I thought that, why I acted that way? And so when a person of color shows emotion or expressive or angry, I know many whites and I have sometimes thought they're not very professional. And so to ask myself, so where did that come from? What are the racist beliefs? Well, you're supposed to be impersonal and professional, has a real white cultural to it. But again, if a person had been white, how have I made assumptions? And mostly I'm thinking leader, passionate. I'm not thinking unprofessional, incompetent. And so those white supremacist attitudes are so near the surface in so many of us. And in a split second, if we're not paying attention, we can have thoughts. If we interrupt them in the moment with questions like this, you know, when have I had passion before, and did that mean that I was unprofessional? So how come I have one standard of behavior and judgment for whites and one for folks of color? Sharing that with trusted whites, as you all come together more and more in affinity spaces, developing relationships, you'll get more honest, you'll pick up the phone, you'll text, you'll say, I need 5 minutes, and you'll be able to debrief with each other instead of just wallowing in guilt and shame and inaction, and maybe even triggered taking it out on folks of color. Be brave enough to start a conversation with yourself and with others, one that matters. Margaret Weekly. And so I just want to highlight this slide that, again, in the book, if you haven't read it yet, I hope you do, you'll see me tell many stories of missteps, racist behaviors that I've had, racist attitudes I struggle over. You can make amends. You can come back and apologize. I noticed I apologize. Do you want to say more about the impact? I regret what I just did. I was wrong. I commit to changing my behavior. And the thing is, you've got to commit to changing your behavior. So my challenge is, if you go back to a person of color and own what you did and apologize, you then go tell 3 whites what you did and say, I want you watching me in meetings, and I'm going to hold myself accountable, but I need you all too to really, if you see me ever do this again, I want you to be watching and helping. And if you want, I'll do the same to you. I want to just mention an activity that I think you can do. I've only done it once or twice. That's when I have a whole day to work with groups. The concept of white privilege. In your new white affinity spaces, which I'm hoping you'll develop, you could read Dr. Peggy McIntosh's seminal work, and there might have been some work that her work was based on that I'm not aware of. That was before, as many things that are written by whites are often built on the work of folks of color that often doesn't get published, or at least didn't. And then I have some sections in my book where I talk about privilege. So I'm just going to pop up. The activity could be, you get people in a circle, a move-in circle, and one person moves in and says something like, I see this is some white privilege I have, or I've seen this play out. And then anybody else that's seen it or experienced, benefited from it, moves in. You pause a moment, you move back. It's like a common ground, but using privilege as the stimulus, if folks are familiar with that activity. I just went back through some notes, and these are just some white privilege examples that I benefit from. When I speak up, I'm seen as an individual, not as a representative of the all white people. And so if I make a mistake, it's on me, and it's not the stereotype of all white. I'm assumed to be smart and capable just walking in a room when people see my skin. I'm assumed to be the leader all the time when I'm working across race. And when I speak, my ideas are considered. My hope is you're relating as you look around, you might be doing, As a white person, I can be concerned about racism, do workshops on it, and actually get rewarded. And I'm not seen as playing the race card, or I'm doing it out of self-interest or something self-seeking. I'm often late to meetings and calls, and it's not reflective of stereotypes about my race. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but every group I'm in, pretty much, every campus I get to, every organization is already immersed in white cultural norms. Most of the leaders are white. The ways of engaging are just white cultural ways of engaging. And so there's just a familiarity and comfort. And so when I show up, I'm heard and seen and assumed to be smart. And then when I've been in organizations, all the policies, practices, programs were set up for whites. Again, I'm not saying it was intentionally racist, but how white culture, and we center whites. So why don't you just take a moment, and facilitators, site coordinators, just see if there are 3 other examples from anybody of examples of white privilege that are either these or something else that they've recognized or they've benefited from. Or this could be a moment someone says, she's moving way too fast. I don't get what white privilege is. And it might be a couple minutes to just someone share their understanding of white privilege, but clearly come back to this in the future. So just take a couple moments. About another 30 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. I love this slide. I think I'm going to make it and just put it in front of me. I need to stay awake every moment, keep waking up. Each of these activities probably represents a year or two of my life development, and you're just getting them all in 3 hours, but I've learned them or experienced them. I wasn't ready for them even 5 years ago, some of them. And so some of these activities, they're finding they're more of a hot button or a trigger. Just know if you just keep coming back and keep being open, keep doing some reading, keep connecting with other whites. And then if you notice you go unconscious, make a commitment to wake up. So we've been at the individual level, and now we've done a lot of work at the group level. I want to show you a couple ways at the organizational level to be paying attention and speaking up and being a white change agent and accomplice. And if you notice, I love this. There's so many blocks that we can see, but there's so many blocks that are hidden. And as we keep pulling some blocks out as we're intervening, we might even find blocks we never knew existed, policies and practices. First thing I want to suggest you do, and this is where I ask the site coordinators to have either a chart pad or just paper. And given the time, you may just want to do it quickly as a large group. I'm going to ask you to identify if you were in charge and could wave a wand and make things happen in collaboration with people of color, what would be the expectations of all the folks in the organization around racial justice? And how could we hold them accountable? So I wanted to start with that first part, principles of community. Many organizations do an activity like this, and they call it the principle of community. They get people to brainstorm and then condense it, bring it back to everybody. So it's a change management process. I just want to dip you into this. We'll talk about it more in future webinars around creating inclusion in April and May. So site coordinator, I'm going to give you a couple minutes. Just brainstorm 5 or 6 with folks. What do we expect from other whites? And let's focus on whites since that's the focus of this. What are the behaviors, how we want whites to treat other whites, and how do we want whites to treat people of color, people of multiracial, biracial? What are the behaviors we expect in our work environment? And then 5 or 6, what are behaviors that cross a line? And I don't ever define that when I do the workshop. I let the group decide. My guess is by now you have a sense of what might help create inclusion or racial justice and behaviors that really undermine microaggressions. So, site coordinator, take 2 or 3 minutes, brainstorm. You might have somebody else write, but get people thinking in these ways, 5 or 6 each. Go ahead. It's about halfway, so if you've not gotten onto the cross line, you may want to move over there. About 30 seconds. Five, four. Somebody asked for more time. Okay, I'll give you another moment or two. About 10 more seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Take a deep breath. I particularly like to do this activity in about a half hour is probably what would be most useful with an entire organization, all levels, all people. And again, if you're focused on race, you may want to do it in race affinity groups and have people discuss and chart for maybe 10 minutes in different small groups, and then do a stations activity where people then move and see what other groups said, and maybe give them 5 or 7 minutes to mill around and see what was said, and then come back together for an open dialogue of impact, questions, wonders. And then, as I said, a cross-race group could then maybe come together and put together something for the entire organization, but then bring it back to have a conversation. Doing this as a white affinity group could be also powerful, because where you find the differences of opinion, or where people feel triggered, or maybe someone's in resistance, that's the place for deeper dialogue. Not trying to force why you think you're right, but say, tell me more, what's your concern about that? That's where people can thaw. As a metaphor, socialization has us frozen as whites and kind of almost robotic. And it takes time to thaw and to, if you believe all the stuff we're talking about today, to then integrate it. And I know I'm grateful for the scores of people and their patience that have spent time with me over the years. So I hope you choose patience. This is a slide from the webinar that might look familiar. These are just some of my expectations that I would want everyone held accountable for, including me. But getting clear as leaders, getting the leaders clear, and then weaving this into your HR practices, into hiring practices, performance management, training, supervision, coaching, so that people have the capacity and the time to develop these capacities. I just want to mention I'm starting a new virtual class, master class for inclusion practitioners on March 30th, and I'll have the link to that towards the end. But it's a place over those 3 months that people that see themselves as change agents, that they could be the ones leading these larger group interventions, working with senior leaders to think about how do we become a more racially just organization, because very few senior leaders have this capacity. And so how do you get skills about creating inclusive organizations, navigating difficult moments, dealing with self-care. So most everything I've written and ever done, I'm going to try to put into this 12-week course to develop these inclusion practitioners that are embedded in units or departments to work with senior leaders to create change. All right, I have a few more things I want to do. So please turn to page 15. So as a white person, when I see other whites' behavior cross a line, if I go into those 4 F's, fight, flight, freeze, flounder, I'm more likely to choose a negative intention. So what's my intention when somebody's behavior crosses a line, in my opinion? So on page 15 on the bottom, just take a quick moment individually and see how many of my negative intentions are familiar to you. You can look at either side of that page. When you've wanted to engage whites, how many of these have you come out of and were probably then ineffective if you're like me? So just take about a minute, try to read half of these. And now site coordinators, just lead like a 90-minute brainstorm. Actually, it's more of a, this one's mine. And see if you can get 5 or 8 people to say, yep, I have wanted to put them in their place or punish them. Just see how many people will admit, yep, these are one of mine. And then see who relates in every time somebody says, yep, I just ignored them. See how many of these people have. Take about 90 seconds. About 10 more seconds. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. My guess is you could relate to a lot of these negative intentions and then the possible impact. And so that could be a wonderful next step too, is for people, when you come back together, say, in this situation, here were my intentions, here's how I responded less effectively, and here was my impact that I'm still trying to clean up with my colleague. Those stories can be very powerful as kind of an advanced next step in an affinity group that's willing to get that honest. What I'd like you to do now is just look at the top of the page, because the skill is especially when my first book, Turn the Tide, a lot of these tools are in there. When you notice your intention, you can intervene and shift from a negative to a productive one. So when I feel myself triggered and I move like I just want to go up, if I say things to myself like, how am I just like them? I've done the same thing. I intend to do no harm. I need to meet them where they are so that I can support whatever their next step is. I want to treat them with the same respect and dignity I want them to treat others. Those are all what I call more productive intentions or thoughts that get me shifted enough to choose a different tool and a different outcome. So just take a moment, again, either side of the page, just read like half and see how many of these look familiar or you want to add as you're engaging whites whose behavior has crossed a line. And in a moment, I'll just let you turn and share with someone real quick. Five, four, three, two, one. So site coordinators just invite people to turn to a partner and each maybe share two that they already use and maybe two they want to add to their toolkit and be more aware of. Just about 90 seconds. About 10 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. A quick strategy is before I'm going to talk to someone about racist behaviors or a racist dynamic in the organization, I reread the top part of the sheet to get regrounded in positive, productive intentions. That will then shift me into choices of engaging that are much more like the PAIRS tools as opposed to ineffective stress reactions. I want to just show you a few more organizational tools and activities that we'll dip into, but each really could be a 30, 40-minute conversation themselves. And if you listen to the webinar, you heard me talk about Tema Okun's work around white cultural practices or white supremacy culture or white dominant culture. And I was just talking to a colleague who said they had heard someone say, we need to take the dominance out of white dominant culture. And so we just have that white cultural practices are one of many ways to engage, not the only way, the right way, and the one that's enforced. And so often it's hard to see these dynamics. It's like a fish in water. And so my hope is you've already gotten her chapter article. Again, you can just Google white supremacy culture or her name, Tema Okun. It'll come up. Sometimes there's another person's name on that, but recently I've only seen her name. So on page 20, I took the 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture and just popped them onto a worksheet. And they're also up here on the screen. And what I want to do is just have you reflect on what are the very ineffective ways that these show up, and what might be a small sliver that sometimes this is useful. And here's why I'm doing this. This is a pretty advanced conversation. And so when you're talking to other whites about this, the resistance will probably come up and they're like, what? I can't have any of my culture? You're telling me I can't be what, right? And so the strategy, and I actually think there are some useful parts of some of this. When is it useful to have some sense of urgency? When is it useful to have very high expectations? So here's what I'd like you to do. On page 20, just select one of the manifestations and make some notes. When and how is it unproductive if that's the way that the culture says you have to be, the organization says you have to be? But what might be one or two aspects you're going to have to maybe pull it back from the extreme, like sense of urgency, back to time is important to pay attention to, like on a 3-hour webinar, right? You got to kind of weigh how much in small groups, how much in large group. And so to model it, I just want to talk perfectionism. Many, especially white women that I know, who probably have class privilege as well, talk about how they're perfectionists and they were taught to and they were required to be. And then they perpetuated themselves. And it's out of, I believe, white culture. And so trying to dismantle that can take a while with an executive coach. But in an organization, I actually think the damage of there's only one right way, it's the white way, and if you're not perfect and you make a mistake, especially as a person of color, you're under a microscope, therefore you're not competent. White people get a lot more room to make mistakes and benefit of the doubt. So perfectionism has a differential impact on people of color, in my opinion, is part of your culture. And you're reworking a lot of work because people are still making mistakes under high stress. And it's just a lot of waste of time, energy, human capital. Sometimes though, you might say, we have a huge conference coming up, and I want to invest more of our time, energy, and attention, our human resources into it, because I really want us to have this be at 90%. A lot of our work might be at 80% and be great, but I'd love to get this up to 90% effective and as close as we can get to what is possible. What do you all think of that? And do you think we can do that? So again, a collaborative conversation that you negotiate it. You don't do it often, but you're explicit and transparent about it. So individually, just see if you look at page 20, is there one of these that's got your attention? And a couple ways, very unproductive, it's the only way, or enforced. But occasionally, is a sense of urgency useful within reason? Is objectivity useful sometimes? So just take a moment. It's about another 10 seconds of reflection. Five, four, three, two, one. Sorry, I did it in the wrong order there. This is a very advanced part. I'm not sure I understand white culture anywhere close to how I need to. So I would encourage you as a white affinity group to get different articles or different life experiences to see what's in our current culture, the ways we engage that privileges whites and has a negative impact on folks of color. I think Tema's article is exceptional and she has anecdotes for each one of these. So I think that's a good place to start. And then I think a cross-race conversation about here's what we're seeing some of our culture is embedded in white supremacy culture. We're trying to think of other ways. It might be a wonderful way to come together across racialized identities and have some conversation about what could be different and then strategize how to support each other, changing how we do it. Speaking of strategizing, I want to spend some time in your large group looking at the organizational level at analyzing policies and practices. So there's the culture, and then when we're operating in this kind of space, we then make policies and practices that most often privilege whites or at least meet whites' needs and create barriers, if not negative discrimination impact on folks of color. So I'm going to give you an example. It's going to be on a slide in a minute. I want the site coordinator in the large group to brainstorm by group membership who might have a negative experience or potentially have a negative impact by this decision. So you're going to use a race lens to identify any possible unintended negative impact on folks of color, folks who are multiracial, biracial, breadth of those intersecting identities, which I will put up in a minute. Here's the situation. Budget crisis, we got to cut back. And someone says, I was looking at the travel budget and we're spending a lot on hotels. So I suggest no longer can people stay at hotels, which means you go in the front door, you get your key, and from that secured area, you go to your room and enter your room. Now people have to stay in motels. You get your key, you come back out to a parking lot, which might have a broken light. You go into your apartment, your hotel room from the outside, from the parking lot area. So by group membership, again, marginalized identity by race, with all these different intersecting identities by race, how could this change in the budget policy be putting folks of color, multiracial, biracial folk into difficult, dangerous, uncomfortable situations possibly? So take a moment, site coordinator, let's let people reflect for like 20 seconds and then try to brainstorm 2 or 3 possible scenarios how this policy would have a differential impact by race on folks of color. About 20 more seconds. 20. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. As I was answering that question myself, I would think many folks of color, particularly medium to dark skin, particularly presenting male or wearing a hijab or wearing a beard, and people might think they're Middle Eastern or Arab. I could keep going, but I would think other folks who are also parking might think they are criminal or violent or call the police. So all kinds of dynamics. But if I had given you 10 minutes just on this one, even 5, I bet you would have come up with a number of different ways. Here's what I'd like to do. This slide has 4 other policies, and I collected them from people that work at colleges. I think some of them can easily be shifted to different community organizations in K-12. What I'd like the site coordinator to do, I have a second one too. I'm just going to quickly highlight them. Just choose one, and I'm then going to have you in a moment have people reflect by group membership. How might this advantage whites? How might this disadvantage people of color? So one college said information sessions to advertise on-campus jobs were only held in the late evenings. Could there be a race cut to that? New students, this one particularly, choose their residence halls as soon as they submit the housing deposit. Now people clearly see the the class, socioeconomic class, but how could race and class potentially be involved in that for some folks of color? To apply for a paid position as an orientation coordinator or an intern, right? You've had to have an unpaid position related to that. How could that privilege whites, disadvantage folks of color? And this one particularly, tenure promotion practices are placing a high value on student evaluations, especially in predominantly white campuses. Here are 4 more you can choose among. And these are subtle. I'm not even sure a lot of folks will see this stuff. In hiring practices, candidates are required to share their salary history. Sometimes you have to go back 2 and 3 pieces of how people got here in order to find how it all started. Campuses, some are still using SATs, ACTs. Some businesses use Strength Finder or maybe a personality test to decide if you're going to be a good candidate or not. So how are those potentially race-based? This one I just had to use because I've heard it 5 times lately. So fraternity, sorority policies at predominantly white campuses require historically majority Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Desi, American, and Native American Greek groups to maintain a baseline membership or run the risk of losing recognition and therefore resources and money. And this last one, I think, was, when I thought about it, I saw a race cut to it. Bereavement policies only covering the deaths of family members, quote, family members. So with that, take about 2 minutes, you choose one, and then have folks brainstorm what could advantage whites, disadvantage people of color, people multiracial, biracial. About 30 seconds. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take a deep breath. Even in that quick moment, I hope you got a flavor of how at the organizational level, you can take any policy, practice, program, or service and ask the question, how might this unintentionally privilege whites or meet the needs of most of our white students? And how might it create barriers or negatively impact our folks of color in our organization, those we're serving? And again, without blame, judgment, and self-righteousness, in an organization, we're going to look at 3 a week in a staff meeting. And that's what we're going to do. My hope is you see how at the individual level we have to look at our own behaviors, our own attitudes.
Kathy.
Yeah, I saw, but I don't know what it is.
Okay, I just wanted to give you a pause for a second because it usually clears up.
Okay.
All right, you sound good now. Thanks.
All right, must have been something in the universe. So these tools and activities to look at our own socialization, get honest, look at the racist attitudes that are still in us and fueling behaviors, our individual behaviors that are microaggressions. At the group level, really looking at what are all those microaggressions and unproductive dynamics around us. How do I speak up, interrupt, more skill development? All this you can do in follow-up conversations. And the organizational level, clear expectations, get those into training, hiring, accountability, performance management, analyzing our culture, shifting our cultural practices, and then looking at every service, policy, program. That's the work moving forward. And some more homework. As you gather with whites, talk about why do you do this work? You talked about passion, but I'd like you to get even more. Why should whites? Why is it critical that whites? But more, why do you do it? And then therefore, how do we get other whites doing it? Other homework? What helped you in your journey? Who helped you? I'm just so aware of all my mentors across racialized identities that have modeled, called me in, called me out, related in, gently and not so gently confronted me. I'm grateful for all of them. And so if a whole conversation could be a life map of, as a white person, who supported you and helped you along the way. And that could be critical moments that were painful and uncomfortable, but you learned a lot. And sharing that could help people really get. But here's the thing. All the things that helped you, especially the support, relating in, compassionate accountability, do that with others. Show up, sharing when you've made mistakes, when you said things racist, how you've gone back and make amends, get honest, vulnerable, and brave, and then do that and leave no one behind, always showing up. Because everything we do as we're working with whites either creates more racism, reinforces the racist status quo, or it dismantles it, interrupts it, and you're creating greater racial justice. And the choice is up to you literally every second, every moment of every day. What are you going to do? It's a lifelong journey. We're always under construction. And I hope you create in your organization and community more and more spaces for whites to come together to do our work, so we don't do our work on people of color, so we're not acting out of racist attitudes and white supremacist beliefs that are negatively impacting our colleagues and the people we serve. And you commit to lifelong learning and to showing up with these folks today and bringing in others to do this work, because our action expresses our priorities. And so if you go into the 4 F's, fight, flight, freeze, flounder, interrupt that, change your intention, and show up brave and speaking up, taking risk. And if you misstep, you own it and you try to make amends. It is time for change. We cannot afford any longer to have so many millions and billions of whites sitting on the sidelines and putting all of this work for racial justice on literally the shoulders and hearts and bodies of people of color. We must do our part, and especially working with other whites. Right or wrong, sometimes whites will hear us and they won't hear folks of color, they'll write them off. And so how do we get whites so they do enough work so they can follow the leadership and direction and partnering with people of color, and not expect and have people of color have to do all that emotional labor? So if you've ever done a workshop with me, you know I always give out way more handouts than we ever even talk about. So I just want to at least highlight pages 21 and 22. Oh, first, if you want something in your life you've never had, you've got to do something you've never done. I hope today you've thought about 8 to 10 activities, conversations you want to keep having, including pages 21, 22, traps and potholes. Dr. Tanya Williams and I were doing a webinar, and we just sat down in front of a warm fireplace in Vermont, and we just brainstormed all the traps and potholes that whites fall into. It's more about privileged group identities, but I think everyone you can relate to whites. So that could be a conversation itself in one of the white affinity groups moving forward. What are the traps you've fallen into recently ever? And how did you get out of it? What did you do those more effective? 23 and 24 is a checklist of what I think are useful behaviors for whites. And if you have some cross-race conversation, I think it'd be useful to hear from folks of color if they agree with some of my ideas. because they may not. And that would be a powerful conversation. So hear what they want. But also, you could go through and check off for yourself, what do I think I'm pretty skilled at? Where do I want to grow? You can share that as a group and use that to decide this is going to be how we're going to do 6 wide affinity groups over the next 6 months. And each one has a different focus. Some of these activities we've done today, plus maybe some of these handouts. All right, take a deep breath. What I want to do is pause for about 3 or 4 minutes and have the site coordinators reflect with people what could be our next steps. And you may just want to give them to reflect. Do they want to come back together and debrief this? Come back and talk about white privilege, to share how far you've come as a white person, but how far you need to go and your missteps since we did this institute. My guess is it'd be powerful to come back together, do the what could you do? And people come with situations, or you could take that handout. What do I do from those common racist behaviors of whites? Or the microaggressions, what would I do? And actually role play, or at least discuss what tools you could use in those moments. And truly continue to deepen your authenticity. Here's the racist behaviors or racist attitude I had yesterday. Getting the group honest enough that you can share that and support each other. Of course, the book clubs, using any of my books that are for free and they're on this packet, as well as other things. So let me just pause for about 3 or 4 minutes. Site coordinators, just begin to have the conversation. What would you all like to do next? And who's willing to help organize? Those are 2 important conversations. So I'll be back in just a couple minutes to close us out. Maybe 1 more minute, 1 more minute. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take a huge deep breath. Whew. I want to just highlight some other free and also virtual institutes that are coming up that could continue to build capacity. In March, I'll be doing a free webinar on recognizing interrupting microaggressions. I'm going to do the full breadth of differences. So this could be a place to bring in many more people from your organization, and especially folks that want to be facilitators or trainers. You'll get a chance to see how I do it. And then I think with the materials, you'll be able to go out and do these workshops. The Virtual Institute could be a place where you bring many people together. It'll be just like this. I'll lead it. We just need site coordinators. And then again, like with this one, you'll have the resources, you have the PowerPoint in a PDF form so that you can, and the handouts so you can continue sharing these with folks. I'm excited about April and May. The first two are more about interpersonal and some systems. I'm going to be moving right to systems in April, helping people realize their tools to help people look at where are we from unexclusive or exclusive to inclusive, and look at multicultural organizational development model. Lots of tools and skills to think about how do we get people shifting to be more effective at the systemic level, shifting policies and practices. And I broke it into two because I'm realizing how much I tried to get into this one. So again, free webinars where I give concepts and some handouts, and then the virtual institutes where I'm leading them, so you don't have to lead them, you just help to kind of help shape. And all the materials that I would use will be right there in your organization. And again, in June, Foundations of Equity and Inclusion, all the basic tools and workshops I do in the lesson plan, we'll go through some. That one particularly be fun to have 20, 30, 50 people at, so you can actually do some of the activities real time, and I'll lead you through them. In the chat room, if you want, if there are other topics you want, I intend to keep doing this at least for a couple years. And I have a lot already through the fall, but I'm open to what you think other ideas could be for webinars and then the corresponding virtual institute each month. For people that want, or you have people in your organization that want a much more in-depth, I'd mentioned that master class. This will be a time to have weekly opportunities with me, lots of video work, readings, it's almost like a whole master's level course or two in how do you be a change agent in your organization at the individual, group, and systems level. I'm very excited about that, and that starts March 30th. And you'll get some emails from me if you haven't already about these. And finally, Catherine's also putting in the links into the chat room if you want to just pop in and pull them out. And finally, I am now working with organizations around a comprehensive professional development program, and this is a long-term that involves, for instance, 30 people in the inclusion masterclass, inclusion practitioner masterclass, all of the virtual institutes for as many people as you want, one-on-one work with me with one major change agent for a year to be a transformational leader, training and consulting for the top leadership and strategy on how to create change. And there are a few other features. So I'm just wanting results for organizations, and I'm finding these one and done workshops aren't necessarily useful all the time. And so I'm going to shift my business to work primarily with a handful of organizations that want to go in depth with me and really find results and develop their internal capacity. Because this is the new normal, let go or be dragged. I hope this webinar and this institute has helped some of you realize, as a white person, you can no longer sit on the sideline. I no longer can be silent when I see, and I can no longer be reactive. I must be proactive in the work that I do as Kathy Aubert, in the work that you do. And as Dr. King said, you take the first step in faith. That might have been joining this institute. You don't have to see the whole staircase to take the next step. It might be to volunteer to help organize the next time you all come together. Maybe somebody else will facilitate it, but you can do the organizing of it. Maybe offer a book club, whether it's my book or somebody else's. One thing about book clubs, make sure you're reading a balance of white authors as well as folk of color authors. And I do think there's a balance that's needed because I think there's a lot of stuff in my book that could be useful, but I am a little biased. And finally, you know the one about the 3 frogs are sitting on a log. It's slimy and cold. One decides to jump off. How many are left? 3 on the log. One decides to jump off. How many are left? I thought the answer was 2, but it's actually 3. The frog made a decision but never took any action. I hope today you are motivated to take action, and I'll close with the Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but as white change agents, we are not free to abandon it. We have to step up our game and be a part of dismantling racism and creating racial justice every moment of every day. Thank you so much, and please give a round of applause for your site coordinators that did a whole bunch to organize this. And please stay in touch. I'd love your feedback, and I'd also love to know what more you're doing in your organizations to keep creating racial justice. And with that, we will officially put a comma in this. I hope we'll see you in future free webinars and maybe some more institutes. All the best to you. Take good care.